In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, death came not with a scream, but with the soft chime of a cuckoo clock. When Mrs. Pritchard was found dead in her armchair, it seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. But Miss Marple knew better, for beneath the ticking of that clock lay a secret engineered to kill. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her best summer hat and contemplated the invitation card in her gloved hand. Mrs. Constance Pritchard's annual garden party at Thornfield House was not, she reflected, an event one attended for pleasure. Rather, it was one of those social obligations that village life imposed upon its more respectable inhabitants, much like church attendance or the yearly flower show committee meetings. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of Thornfield House as Miss Marple made her way up the gravel drive. The Georgian mansion stood imposing against the backdrop of ancient oaks, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. She paused to admire the rose garden, noting with a gardener's eye that the blooms were somewhat past their prime. Rather like their hostess, she thought with gentle charity. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you." She turned to find Miss Hartwell approaching, her thin face creased with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. As Mrs. Pritchard's companion for the past 5 years, Miss Hartwell had developed the slightly anxious manner of one who lived perpetually at the mercy of another's moods. "Such a lovely afternoon for the party," Miss Marple observed, though she had noticed the gathering clouds on the horizon. "Mrs. Pritchard must be pleased with the weather." Miss Hartwell's smile flickered momentarily. "Oh yes, indeed, though you know how particular she is about everything being just so. She's been in quite a state about the arrangements all week." They walked together toward the terrace, where a small crowd had gathered around white-clothed tables laden with delicate china and silver. Miss Marple's experienced eye took in the familiar faces of St. Mary Me's social circle, as well as several she did not immediately recognize. Mrs. Pritchard herself held court near the French windows, her substantial figure draped in dark purple silk that seemed rather ferial for such a festive occasion. At 73, she remained a formidable presence, her steel gray hair perfectly arranged and her pale blue eyes sharp as winter frost. She was engaged in conversation with a tall, nervous-looking man whom Miss Marple recognized as Robert Pritchard, her late husband's son from his first marriage. "Robert's been having rather a difficult time of it lately," Miss Hartwell murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Business troubles, you know, and Mrs. Pritchard is not well. She's not particularly sympathetic to financial difficulties." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had observed over the years that money troubles often brought out the worst in family relationships, much like the unfortunate incident with the Wetherby family and their contested inheritance. A woman's laugh, rather too bright and artificial, drew their attention to another group near the rose arbor. Millicent Devoe, Mrs. Pritchard's stepdaughter, was speaking animatedly to Dr. Haddock, though her smile seemed strained. Miss Marple noticed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, a sure sign of nervous tension. "And who might that be?" Miss Marple inquired, indicating a slight dark-haired woman who stood somewhat apart from the main groups, studying the house with an intensity that seemed almost proprietary. "Oh, that's Miss Fenwick," Miss Hartwell replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Miss Evelina Fenwick. She's recently taken lodgings at Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house. Rather mysterious, really. She says she's researching her family history, but she seems to know an awful lot about the village already." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. In her experience, people who claimed to be researching family history often had more immediate and pressing reasons for their investigations. A sudden harsh mechanical sound shattered the gentile murmur of conversation. From within the house came the aggressive cuckoo call that Miss Marple remembered from previous visits. 12 strident notes that seemed to mock the civilized gathering. Mrs. Pritchard's face darkened with annoyance. "That wretched clock," she declared loudly enough for all to hear. "Have half a mind to have the thing destroyed. It's been nothing but a nuisance since the day my dear husband brought it home from Switzerland." "Perhaps it could be repaired," suggested Dr. Haydock mildly. "Old Mr. Whitmore in the village is quite skilled with clockwork." "Repaired?" Mrs. Pritchard's voice rose sharply. "I'd sooner see it thrown in the river. There are some things in this world that are better off broken, Doctor." Some things that serve no purpose but to remind us of past mistakes. An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Miss Marple noticed how Miss Fenwick's attention had sharpened at these words, her dark eyes fixed on Mrs. Pritchard with an expression that was difficult to read. "Now, Mother," Robert Pritchard said nervously, "surely there's no need to be so dramatic about a clock." Mrs. Pritchard turned on him with surprising venom. "Don't you dare call me mother, young man. I am not your mother, and I never shall be. Your father may have chosen to burden me with his ungrateful offspring, but that doesn't make us family." The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple saw Robert's face flush with embarrassment and anger. Millicent had gone quite pale, her teacup rattling against its saucer. "People seem to forget," Mrs. Pritchard continued, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace, "that gratitude is a virtue. Too many individuals in this world believe they're entitled to what isn't theirs, that they can simply appear and claim what they've never earned." Her gaze swept the gathering, lingering meaningfully on her stepchildren, and rather oddly on Miss Fenwick. The mysterious woman met her stare steadily, and Miss Marple detected something almost like recognition passing between them. The cuckoo clock chimed again, its mechanical voice seeming to mock the tension that had settled over the party like a shroud. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected that she had rarely attended a social gathering where so many undercurrents of emotion ran beneath the surface of polite conversation. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself drawn repeatedly to observe the small dramas playing out among the guests. There was definitely something brewing at Thornfield House, something that went far deeper than mere family discord. The air itself seemed charged with secrets and suppressed resentments, and Miss Marple's long experience with human nature told her that such situations rarely resolve themselves peacefully. The clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally opened, sending the guests scurrying for shelter. As Miss Marple hurried toward the house, she could not shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within the walls of Thornfield House. The morning after Mrs. Pritchard's garden party dawned crisp and clear, the storm having washed the air clean and left the gardens of St. Mary sparkling with dewdrops. Miss Marple emerged from her cottage at an early hour, basket in hand, to tend to her beloved roses. The events of the previous afternoon had lingered in her mind like an unfinished melody, and she found that physical activity often helped to sort through the tangled threads of human behavior. As she deadheaded the pale pink blooms of her favorite climbing rose, she reflected on the curious tableau she had witnessed at Thornfield House. In her many years of observing village life, she had learned to recognize the signs of impending trouble, much like a sailor might read the subtle shifts in wind and weather that preaged a storm. The tension at yesterday's gathering had been palpable, and she could not shake the feeling that Mrs. Pritchard's harsh words had been more than mere ill temper. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her daily help, Mrs. Briggs, who appeared at the garden gate with her usual collection of village news and gossip. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Briggs called cheerfully. "Lovely morning after all that rain, isn't it?" Though I dare say it didn't improve Mrs. Pritchard's mood any. Cousin Ethel, who works at the post office, says she was in there first thing this morning, sending off urgent letters to London solicitors, most likely, from the look of the addresses. Miss Marple straightened her interest, immediately engaged. How very enterprising of Mrs. Pritchard to be conducting business so early in the day. Well, you know how she is about getting her own way, Mrs. Briggs continued, warming to her subject. Always has been, ever since she married old Mr. Pritchard, though I must say those stepchildren of hers looked proper upset when they left the party yesterday. My nephew Billy was walking past the house around 9 o'clock, and he heard raised voices coming from the drawing room. This intelligence was particularly intriguing, and Miss Marple filed it away for future consideration. She had learned over the years that the servants' network of information was often more reliable than any official investigation. After Mrs. Briggs had departed to attend to her other duties, Miss Marple decided that a visit to the village might prove illuminating. She made her way to the post office, where she found Mrs. Carmichael, the proprietor of the local boarding house, engaged in animated conversation with Miss Polet, the post mistress. "Such a peculiar thing," Mrs. Carmichael was saying as Miss Marple approached. That Miss Fenwick of mine. She's been asking the most extraordinary questions about the village history. Wanted to know all about the old families, particularly the Pritchards. Said she was researching her family tree. But I've never seen anyone take such a detailed interest in cemetery records and old parish registers. Miss Polet nodded knowingly. She was in here just yesterday asking about mail delivery to Thornfield House. Wanted to know if Mrs. Pritchard received much correspondence from abroad. Rather an odd question for a casual acquaintance to ask, don't you think? Miss Marple purchased her stamps and listened with the practiced ear of one who understood that village gossip often contained kernels of important truth. The picture of Miss Fenwick that was emerging was increasingly intriguing. A woman who professed to be a stranger to the village, but who seemed remarkably well informed about local affairs. Her next stop was the greengrocer's, where she encountered Dr. Haydock, selecting vegetables for his lunch. The good doctor looked rather more serious than usual, and Miss Marple suspected that his professional duties had brought him some cause for concern. "Good morning, doctor," she said pleasantly. "I do hope you're not finding too many of your patients suffering from the effects of yesterday's weather." Dr. Hawk glanced around to ensure they were not overheard before responding. "Actually, Miss Marple, I'm rather worried about Mrs. Pritchard. She sent for me this morning complaining of chest pains and difficulty sleeping. When I examined her, I found her pulse rather irregular, and she seemed unusually agitated." "I'm sorry to hear that," Miss Marple replied with genuine concern. "She did seem rather overwrought at the party yesterday. Indeed, she kept going on about family troubles and old grievances, mentioned something about people who think they can waltz back into one's life and claim what isn't theirs. Rather dramatic language, even for Mrs. Pritchard." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The doctor's words echoed the hostile sentiments expressed at the garden party, and she began to suspect that Mrs. Pritchard's troubles went deeper than mere family discord. After completing her shopping, Miss Marple decided to call upon her dear friend Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. She found Dolly Bantry in her morning room, engaged in the thankless task of arranging flowers that had been somewhat battered by the previous evening's storm. "Jane, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, setting aside her secrets. "I was just thinking about yesterday's party. What a dreadful atmosphere there was. Poor Mrs. Pritchard seemed quite beside herself." "It was rather uncomfortable," Miss Marple agreed, settling into the comfortable chintz armchair that had become her customary seat during these visits. "I couldn't help but notice how upset the family appeared to be." "Oh, my dear, you've heard about the financial difficulties, haven't you?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "Conspirator ally. Robert Pritchard has been gambling rather heavily, from what I understand. Lost quite a substantial sum at some club in London. And as for poor Millicent, her husband's medical bills are mounting dreadfully. The nursing home fees alone are quite ruinous." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. Financial desperation had been the motive for many a family tragedy, as she well knew from her years of observing human nature. "And what do you make of the mysterious Miss Fenwick?" she inquired. Mrs. Bantry's expression grew thoughtful. "Rather an odd creature, isn't she? She seems to know a great deal about the village, for someone who's only recently arrived. Yesterday, she was asking me about the old days, when the Pritchards were more prominent in local society. Wanted to know about Mr. Pritchard's first wife, and whether there had been any other children in the family." "How very curious," Miss Marple observed. "One would think that sort of information would be readily available from official records." "That's exactly what I thought. But when I mentioned the parish registers, she became quite evasive. Said she preferred to hear about the family from people who had actually known them." Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected on this latest piece of the puzzle. In her experience, people who avoided official records often had compelling reasons for doing so. The image of Miss Fenwick was becoming increasingly complex, and she began to suspect that the woman's interest in the Pritchard family history was far from academic. As she walked home through the village lanes, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the patterns of human behavior that she had observed over the years. There was something about the dynamic at Thornfield House that reminded her of other family situations she had encountered, situations where long-buried secrets and old resentments had eventually erupted into violence. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees as she reached her cottage, and she paused to deadhead a few more roses before going inside. As she worked, she reflected on the various threads of information she had gathered during her morning's excursion. Separately, each piece of gossip might seem insignificant, but together they formed a pattern that made her increasingly uneasy. She had learned to trust her instincts about such matters, and her instincts told her that trouble was brewing at Thornfield House. Trouble that might well prove more serious than mere family discord. The third day following Mrs. Pritchard's garden party began much like any other in St. Mary, with the gentle sounds of village life filtering through Miss Marple's open windows. She had risen early, as was her custom, and after attending to her correspondence over breakfast, decided that a walk to the church would provide both spiritual refreshment and an opportunity to observe the daily rhythms of village life. The morning air was particularly crisp, carrying with it the scent of late summer roses and the faint smell of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar path that wound between the ancient yew trees, her steps unhurried but purposeful. She had always found that the churchyard provided an excellent vantage point for observing the comings and goings of the village, and this morning proved no exception. As she approached the lych gate, she became aware of raised voices coming from the shadow of the church wall. Instinctively, she paused behind a particularly substantial yew tree, not from any desire to eavesdrop, but rather from the natural caution that comes with age and experience. You cannot simply appear after all these years and expect. The voice was unmistakably Mrs. Pritchard's, though it carried a note of strain that Miss Marple had not heard before. "I expect nothing," came the reply, spoken by someone whose voice she could not immediately place. "But I deserve everything." The exchange was brief, and Miss Marple caught only fragments of what followed. Something about rightful claims and the truth coming out. When she finally ventured around the yew tree, she saw Mrs. Pritchard walking rapidly toward the village, her usually composed demeanor distinctly ruffled. Of her companion, there was no sign, though Miss Marple thought she detected a figure disappearing through the far gate of the churchyard. Somewhat troubled by this encounter, Miss Marple continued on her way to the church, where she intended to arrange some flowers from her garden for the Sunday service. She found the vicar, Mr. Clement, in his study, but was surprised to discover that she was not his only visitor of the morning. "Ah, Miss Marple," the vicar said, rising from his desk, where he had been examining a large leather-bound volume. "How delightful to see you. I was just showing Miss Fenwick some of our historical records. She's been most interested in tracing the local families." Miss Fenwick looked up from the parish register she had been studying, and Miss Marple noted that the woman appeared somewhat flustered at the interruption. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said with a smile that seemed forced. "I hope you don't mind my taking up so much of Mr. Clement's valuable time." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied graciously. "How fascinating that you should be interested in our local history. Have you discovered anything particularly intriguing about your family connections?" For a moment, Miss Fenwick hesitated, and Miss Marple observed a flicker of something caution perhaps, or even guilt cross her features. "Oh, you know how these things are," she said eventually. "Family trees can be terribly complicated, especially when records are incomplete." Mr. Clement nodded sympathetically. "Indeed, Miss Fenwick has been particularly interested in the Pritchard family genealogy. Apparently, she believes there may be some connection through her maternal line." This intelligence was most illuminating, and Miss Marple filed it away for future consideration. After Miss Fenwick had departed with profuse thanks for the vicar's assistance, Miss Marple lingered to arrange her flowers and to engage Mr. Clement in what appeared to be casual conversation about the village's older families. Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself in the village high street, where she encountered Mr. Whitmore emerging from his small clock repair shop. The elderly craftsman had been tending to the timepieces of St. Mary for more than 40 years, and his expertise was sought after throughout the county. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she greeted him warmly. "I do hope business is prospering." "Oh, tolerably well, Miss Marple. Tolerably well," he replied, though his expression suggested something was troubling him. "Though I must say, I've had some rather odd requests lately. Just yesterday, someone was asking me all manner of detailed questions about cuckoo clocks, how they work, how they might be repaired, whether the mechanism could be altered in any particular way. Miss Marple's interest was immediately aroused. How very curious. Was it someone from the village? Mr. Whitmore scratched his grizzled head thoughtfully. Well, that's just the thing, Miss Marple. The person seemed to know quite a bit about clockwork already. More than your average customer would ask very specific questions about timing mechanisms and whether certain modifications could be made without detection. This conversation left Miss Marple with much to ponder, and she decided that a social call upon Mrs. Pritchard might prove enlightening. Accordingly, she made her way to Thornfield House, where she was admitted by Miss Hartwell, who seemed even more anxious than usual. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Miss Hartwell said, though her voice carried a note of strain. "Mrs. Pritchard is in the drawing room, though I must warn you that she's been rather unsettled today." Miss Marple was shown into the familiar drawing room, where she immediately noticed that several pieces of furniture had been rearranged since her last visit. The large armchair in which Mrs. Pritchard usually sat had been moved closer to the fireplace, and a small side table had been repositioned near the window. Most notably, the infamous Cuckoo clock appeared to have been recently cleaned and polished, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon light. Mrs. Pritchard herself was seated in her relocated chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her face bearing an expression of barely controlled agitation. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for a moment seemed not to recognize her visitor, Mrs. Pritchard. Miss Marple said gently, "I do hope I'm not intruding. I thought perhaps you might enjoy some company this afternoon." "Company," Mrs. Pritchard repeated as though the word were foreign to her. "Yes, I suppose one can never be certain who might call unexpectedly these days. People from the past have a way of reappearing when one least expects them." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite her hostess and accepted the tea that Miss Hartwell nervously provided. As they conversed, she became increasingly aware that Mrs. Pritchard's usual sharp focus seemed somewhat scattered, and her comments frequently drifted into cryptic observations about trust and betrayal. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard said suddenly, her pale eyes fixing on her guest with unexpected intensity, "old sins cast long shadows. One thinks that the past is buried and forgotten, but it has a way of refusing to stay dead." The cuckoo clock chose that moment to announce the hour with its mechanical call, and Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Pritchard's face tightened with what appeared to be more than mere annoyance. "I've had that wretched thing seen too," Mrs. Pritchard said, noting the direction of Miss Marple's gaze. "Someone suggested that proper maintenance might improve its behavior, though I rather doubt anything can cure its fundamental malevolence." As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, she reflected on the strange undercurrents that seemed to be flowing through the peaceful village of St. Mary, Maine. The morning's encounters had left her with the distinct impression that forces were at work beneath the surface of ordinary village life, forces that might well prove more dangerous than anyone suspected. The tranquil morning of Thursday, September 15th, was shattered by Miss Hartwell's piercing scream echoing across the grounds of Thornfield House. It was precisely 8 when the sound reached the ears of Mrs. Jenkins, who was hanging, washing in the garden of the adjoining cottage, and she would later testify to the exact time with the certainty of one whose life revolved around domestic routine. Miss Marple, who had been deadheading her late roses in preparation for autumn, heard the cry carried on the still morning air, and felt the familiar chill of premonition that she had learned to trust over the years. Without hesitation, she gathered her gardening gloves and made her way with surprising speed toward Thornfield House. She arrived to find Miss Hartwell standing in the front hall, her face chalk white and her hands trembling uncontrollably. The poor woman was quite beyond speech, capable only of pointing toward the drawing room with a shaking finger. Dr. Haddock's motor car was already pulling into the drive. Summoned Miss Marple supposed it by telephone. "My dear Miss Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, taking the distraught woman's arm, "perhaps you should sit down. Dr. Haddock will see to everything now." The doctor emerged from the drawing room some minutes later, his usually cheerful countenance grave with professional concern. He approached the two women with the measured steps of one bearing unwelcome news. "I'm afraid Mrs. Pritchard has passed away," he announced quietly. "It appears to have been quite peaceful. Heart failure from all appearances. She was found in her chair with a book in her lap, as though she had simply fallen asleep while reading. Miss Hartwell's sob echoed through the hall, and Miss Marple guided her to a chair while Dr. Haydock attended to the necessary formalities. It was not until some time later, when the initial shock had subsided and the official procedures were underway, that Miss Marple found an opportunity to observe the scene of Mrs. Pritchard's death. The drawing room presented a picture of serene domesticity. Mrs. Pritchard sat in her favorite armchair, her reading spectacles still perched on her nose, and a volume of poetry open in her lap. Her expression was one of complete tranquility, as though death had come as a gentle friend rather than an unwelcome visitor. Yet something about the scene struck Miss Marple as not quite right, though she could not immediately identify the source of her unease. She moved slowly around the room, her experienced eye taking in every detail, with the thoroughness that had served her well in past observations of human behavior. The armchair, she noticed, was positioned differently than it had been during her visit just 2 days earlier. It had been moved several feet closer to the window, though she could not immediately discern any reason for this alteration. The small side table that usually held Mrs. Pritchard's reading materials had also been repositioned, now standing at an awkward angle that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Most curious of all was the cuckoo clock, which hung silent and motionless on the wall. Miss Marple distinctly remembered hearing it chime during her recent visit, yet now its mechanism appeared to have ceased functioning entirely. The hands were frozen at 20 minutes 12, and no amount of gentle examination revealed any obvious cause for its sudden failure. As she moved closer to Mrs. Pritchard's chair, Miss Marple became aware of a faint, sweet odor that seemed oddly out of place in the familiar room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it reminded her of something she could not quite place, a scent that seemed to hint at bitter almonds, though there were no such items visible in the room. Dr. Haddock completed his examination and arranged for the removal of Mrs. Pritchard's body, while Miss Hartwell, somewhat recovered from her initial shock, began the melancholy task of notifying the family. The stepchildren arrived within hours, Robert appearing haggard and nervous, while Millicent seemed genuinely distressed by the news. The funeral arrangements were made with a surprising speed, perhaps reflecting Mrs. Pritchard's own preference for efficiency in all matters. The service was scheduled for the following Monday at St. Mary Mead's Parish Church, with the reading of the will to follow on Tuesday at the offices of Messrs. Petton and Associates in the nearby market town. Miss Marple attended the funeral, as did most of the village, for Mrs. Pritchard had been a prominent figure in local society, despite her difficult temperament. The church was filled with the subdued murmur of Moors dressed in appropriate black, and the service proceeded with the solemn dignity befitting such occasions. Mr. Clement delivered a tactful eulogy that managed to speak kindly of Mrs. Pritchard's contributions to village life, while avoiding any reference to her more challenging personal qualities. The hymns were sung with suitable reverence, and the prayers offered with genuine sincerity. It was during the final prayer that the incident occurred, which would later prove so significant. As the congregation stood with bowed heads, the silence was suddenly broken by the familiar mechanical sound of a cuckoo clock. 12 clear, strident notes rang out across the church, causing a visible stir among the Moors. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and several heads turned in confusion toward the church tower, though the clock there showed a different time entirely. Miss Marple observed the reactions of those around her with particular interest. Robert Pritchard started visibly at the sound, while Millicent seemed to shrink into herself as though seeking to become invisible. Most notably absent from the gathering was Miss Fenwick, whose continued research into village history had become a subject of considerable local interest. Mrs. Carmichael, when questioned after the service, reported that her lodger had departed early that morning on urgent business, leaving no indication of when she might return. Dr. Haddock, when consulted about the mysterious chiming, could offer no explanation beyond the observation that old buildings sometimes created acoustic peculiarities that could carry sounds in unexpected ways. Yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that the timing of the incident was more than mere coincidence. As the congregation filed slowly from the church, Miss Marple lingered in her pew, reflecting on the curious events that had surrounded Mrs. Pritchard's death. The peaceful scene in the drawing room, the rearranged furniture, the stopped clock, and now this mysterious chiming during the funeral service. Each detail might seem insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that her long experience with human nature told her was worth careful consideration. The autumn afternoon was drawing to a close as she finally made her way home, and the first evening stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Yet sleep would not come easily that night, for her mind remained occupied with the troubling conviction that Mrs. Pritchard's death had been anything but the peaceful natural conclusion it appeared to be. The tranquil aftermath of Mrs. Pritchard's funeral was shattered on Wednesday morning by the arrival of Inspector Slack's official motor car at Thornfield House. Word traveled swiftly through the village, as such news invariably does, and by midday the entire population of St. Mary was aware that the post-mortem examination had revealed something decidedly unnatural about the widow's death. Miss Marple of this development from Dr. Haddock himself, who called upon her shortly after lunch with a troubled expression that spoke volumes about his professional concerns. "I must confess, Miss Marple, that I am deeply disturbed by these findings," he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered with hands that trembled slightly. The pathologist discovered traces of a plant alkaloid in Mrs. Pritchard's system, quite enough to cause cardiac arrest in someone of her age and constitution. "How very shocking," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested that the news came as less of a surprise to her than it might have to others. "And I suppose this means that Inspector Slack will be conducting a thorough investigation." Dr. Haddock nodded grimly. "Indeed he will. The inspector has already begun interviewing the household and family members. I fear it will be a most unpleasant business for all concerned." Miss Marple reflected on this intelligence as she went about her afternoon tasks. The revelation of poison explained much about her unease regarding the scene in Mrs. Pritchard's drawing-room, particularly the curious sweet scent she had detected. Her long experience with village life had taught her that such methods of murder were often employed by those who possessed both patience and intimate knowledge of their victims' habits. That evening, Miss Hartwell appeared at Miss Marple's cottage in a state of considerable distress. The poor woman had clearly been weeping, and her usual composed demeanor had given way to nervous agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, accepting the offered chair gratefully, "I hardly know what to think or whom to trust. The inspector has been asking such dreadful questions, and I fear I may have said things that will cast suspicion on innocent people." "I'm sure you told the truth, as you know it," Miss Marple said gently. "That is all anyone can ask of us in such circumstances." Miss Hartwell dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The inspector seemed particularly interested when I mentioned that Mrs. Pritchard had been afraid recently. She had confided in me, you see, that she feared someone might wish to harm her. She said that old secrets have a way of demanding payment, and that she had been receiving threatening messages." This revelation was most illuminating, and Miss Marple encouraged Miss Hartwell to continue. She had become quite convinced that someone from her past had returned to settle old scores. Miss Hartwell continued. "She kept saying that people never forget injuries, and that time only makes revenge sweeter to those who nurse grudges." The following day brought the reading of Mrs. Pritchard's will, an event that sent shock waves through both the family and the village at large. Miss Marple learned the details from Mrs. Bantry, who had encountered Mealy's Devo in the village shortly after the proceedings. "My dear Jane, you simply cannot imagine this scene," Mrs. Bantry reported with barely concealed excitement. "The bulk of the estate, nearly everything, in fact, has been left to someone called Evelina Fenwick, described in the will as Mrs. Pritchard's beloved niece. The stepchildren received only token amounts, barely enough to cover their immediate debts." Miss Marple absorbed this information with considerable interest. The timing of such a bequest coming so soon after Miss Fenwick's arrival in the village seemed remarkably convenient. "And how did the family react to this news?" she inquired. "Robert was absolutely thunderstruck," Mrs. Bantry continued. "Apparently, he had been counting on the inheritance to settle his gambling debts. Millicent was more controlled, but one could see she was devastated. The nursing home fees for her husband have been mounting terribly. The investigation proceeded with Inspector Slack's characteristic thoroughness, though Miss Marple noted that his methods lacked the subtle understanding of human nature that such cases often required. She learned from various village sources that the inspector had found significant weaknesses in the alibis of both stepchildren. Robert Pritchard claimed to have been at his club in London on the evening of his stepmother's death, but the porter could only confirm his presence until shortly after dinner. The return journey to St. Mary Mead would have been quite possible by the late train, allowing him to reach Thornfield House during the critical hours. Millicent's alibi appeared more substantial, as she had indeed visited her husband at the nursing home that afternoon. However, the staff could not account for her whereabouts during the entire evening, and the facility was only an hour's drive from the village. Most intriguingly, Miss Fenwick remained conspicuously absent from the village, her lodgings at Mrs. Carmichael's standing and empty, with no indication of when she might return. The solicitors handling the estate reported that they had been unable to contact their primary beneficiary despite having clear instructions for reaching her. Feeling that the official investigation might benefit from a more nuanced understanding of local dynamics, Miss Marple decided to conduct some inquiries of her own. Her first stop was Mr. Whitmore's clock repair shop, where she hoped to learn more about the mysterious technical questions that had been posed regarding Cuckoo clock mechanisms. She found the elderly craftsman in his workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking of numerous timepieces in various stages of repair. His weathered face brightened at her arrival, though she detected an underlying anxiety in his manner. "Miss Marple, how pleasant to see you," he said, setting aside the delicate mechanism he had been examining. "Though I fear these are troubling times for our peaceful village." "Indeed they are, Mr. Whitmore," she agreed. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day regarding those unusual questions about cuckoo clocks. I wonder if you might recall any additional details about that inquiry." Mr. Whitmore's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, now that you mention it, the person seemed particularly interested in timing mechanisms, specifically whether one could arrange for a clock to release something at a predetermined moment. Rather an odd question when you think about it." "Most peculiar indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did this person seem familiar with clockwork in general?" "Oh, yes, definitely. Knew far more than the average customer about springs and escapements and such. Asked very technical questions about modifying the mechanism without leaving obvious traces of tampering." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the implications of Mr. Whitmore's information. The picture that was emerging suggested a methodical and knowledgeable killer, someone who had planned Mrs. Pritchard's death with considerable care and technical expertise. The combination of botanical poison and mechanical precision pointed to a perpetrator of unusual sophistication, someone who understood both the science of murder and the art of misdirection. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Yet Miss Marple's long experience had taught her that patience and careful observation would eventually reveal the truth, no matter how cleverly it had been concealed. Miss Marple's opportunity to share her observations with Inspector Slack came sooner than expected. The inspector, having reached something of an impasse in his official investigation, appeared at her cottage on Friday morning with the slightly desperate air of a man who had exhausted his conventional resources. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting her offer of tea with uncharacteristic humility, "I understand you've been taking an interest in this business at Thornfield House. Dr. The Headache suggested that your local knowledge might prove valuable to the investigation." Miss Marple settled herself in her favorite chair and regarded the inspector with the mild expression that often preceded her most penetrating observations. "It does remind me rather of a case I encountered some years ago in Little Wickham," she began thoughtfully. "A similar situation involving family secrets and someone who returned from the past with vengeance in mind." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Go on." "Well, in that instance, a young woman had been cast out from her family under disgraceful circumstances," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles clicking gently as she spoke. 20 years later, she returned under an assumed identity, having spent considerable time researching the family's affairs and planning her revenge. The motive was not financial gain, you understand, but the desire to inflict the same pain and humiliation she had suffered. The inspector frowned. "You think this Miss Fenwick might be operating under false pretenses?" "I think, Inspector, that Miss Evelina Fenwick may not be who she claims to be at all," Miss Marple replied gently. Perhaps it would be worth investigating the authenticity of her identity more thoroughly. This suggestion prompted Inspector Slack to request assistance from his colleagues in London, and by that afternoon, disturbing information had begun to emerge. The real Elenina Fenwick, Mrs. Pritchard's legitimate niece, had died of influenza in Toronto some 20 years previously. The death certificate, when obtained from the Canadian authorities, revealed that she had never married and left no descendants who might have carried on her name. Armed with this intelligence, Inspector Slack returned to Miss Marple with renewed respect for her insights. "You were quite right about the identity question," he admitted. "But if this woman isn't Elenina Fenwick, who is she? And how did she know enough about the family to carry off such a deception?" Miss Marple had spent the intervening hours in quiet reflection, and her answer came without hesitation. "I believe she has been studying the Pritchard family for quite some time, Inspector. Someone with such detailed knowledge of their history and circumstances doesn't acquire it overnight." Her suspicions were confirmed when Mrs. Polet at the post office remembered that the mysterious Miss Fenwick had indeed received regular correspondence from London over the past several months. The letters, Mrs. Pollock recalled with the precision of one whose professional duties involved intimate knowledge of local postal affairs, had come from various official sources, Somerset House, parish record offices, and genealogical societies. Furthermore, Miss Marple's discreet inquiries among the Ville's network of domestic servants revealed that Miss Fenwick had been asking unusually specific questions about the Pritchard family's private affairs. Mrs. Jenkins, who had worked briefly at Thornfield House during the war years, remembered being questioned about old family photographs and whether Mrs. Pritchard had ever mentioned any relatives beyond her husband's children. The breakthrough in understanding came when Miss Marple suggested that Inspector Slack examined the parish records for any mention of irregular births connected to the Pritchard family. Mr. Clement the Vicar proved most helpful in this regard, though he expressed considerable reluctance to reveal information that had been kept confidential for decades. "I must ask for your complete discretion in this matter," he said, producing a leather-bound volume from a locked cabinet in his study. "The entry I'm about to show you represents a family tragedy that was handled with as much sensitivity as possible at the time. The record, dating back some 35 years, told a story of scandal that had been carefully concealed from village scrutiny. Mrs. Pritchard, then Miss Constance Bellwood, had given birth to an illegitimate daughter during a brief affair with a traveling artist. The child had been quietly removed from the village and placed with a family in the north of England, with arrangements made for her ongoing maintenance until she reached majority. Inspector Slack studied the faded entry with growing interest. "Margaret Sutton," he read aloud. "Born March 15th, 1890. Father unknown, though there's a note here about financial arrangements being handled through a London solicitor." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And I suspect that if you were to investigate this Margaret Sutton's subsequent history, you would find a trail leading directly back to our mysterious Miss Fenwick." The inspector's inquiries, conducted with the assistance of his London colleagues, revealed exactly such a connection. Margaret Sutton had grown up in Yorkshire under the care of a respectable but modest family. She had received an excellent education, partly funded by the anonymous allowance that had arrived regularly throughout her childhood, and had eventually found employment as a governess and companion to wealthy families. Most significantly, the record showed that she had spent considerable time abroad, including several years in Canada, where she might easily have encountered the genuine Elenina Fenwick and learned enough about her circumstances to assume her identity after her death. "The pattern becomes clear when one understands the motive," Miss Marple explained to Inspector Slack as they sat in her cottage that evening, reviewing the day's discoveries. "This was never about money, though the inheritance provided a convenient means of legitimizing her claim to the family. It was about revenge for a lifetime of shame and abandonment." Inspector Slack rubbed his tired eyes. "But how did she manage to get herself written into Mrs. Pritchard's will? Surely that would have required considerable manipulation." "Ah, but consider the psychology involved," Miss Marple replied. "Mrs. Pritchard was an elderly woman, increasingly isolated and bitter about her family relationships. The sudden appearance of a charming niece who showed genuine interest in her welfare would have been irresistible, particularly if this niece subtly reminded her of past guilt regarding abandoned family obligations. The inspector was beginning to appreciate the depth of planning that had gone into the crime. So this Margaret Sutton, calling herself Elenina Fenwick, spent months ingratiating herself with Mrs. Pritchard while simultaneously learning about the house, the routines, and the famous cuckoo clock. Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm as she considered the implications. Human nature is remarkably predictable in certain circumstances, Inspector. A woman who had spent her entire life wondering about the mother who abandoned her would naturally be drawn to seek both understanding and retribution. The tragedy is that revenge so rarely brings the satisfaction one expects. As the evening shadows lengthened across the cottage garden, Miss Marple reflected on the bitter irony of the situation. Mrs. Pritchard's death had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that had taken years to develop, driven not by greed, but by the deep wounds of a child who had grown up believing herself unwanted and unloved. The mechanical precision of the murder method seemed somehow fitting for a crime that had been executed with such methodical attention to detail. Saturday morning found Miss Marple in her garden once again, though her attention was focused less on the late autumn blooms than on the intricate puzzle that had been occupying her thoughts. Inspector Slack was expected shortly, and she had spent the early hours of the day carefully organizing her observations into a coherent explanation of how Mrs. Pritchard's murder had been accomplished. When the inspector arrived, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple invited them into her sitting room, where she had prepared a small demonstration using her own mantelpiece clock and several household items. The key to understanding this crime, she began settling into her customary chair, lies in appreciating the mechanical ingenuity involved. Our murderer possessed not only the motive and opportunity, but also the technical knowledge necessary to convert an ordinary timepiece into an instrument of death. Inspector Slack examined the items Miss Marple had arranged on the table. You mentioned something about the cuckoo clock being used as a weapon. I must confess, I don't quite see how that would be possible. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Precisely the reaction our killer was counting on. Inspector, the beauty of this method lies in its apparent impossibility. Consider the sequence of events. Mrs. Pritchard is found dead in her chair, apparently having succumbed to heart failure while reading. The cuckoo clock has stopped working, which appears to be merely an unfortunate coincidence. No one thinks to examine the clock mechanism because it seems entirely unrelated to the death. Dr. Hawk leaned forward with professional interest. But how could a clock deliver a fatal dose of poison? By converting the cuckoo's emergence mechanism into a delivery system, Miss Marple explained patiently. You'll recall that someone had been asking Mr. Whitmore detailed questions about clock modifications. Our murderer needed to understand exactly how to alter the mechanism without leaving obvious traces. She gestured toward her demonstration materials. The cuckoo mechanism operates on a simple principle. At the appointed time, a spring releases the wooden bird from its housing. With careful modification, this same mechanism could be arranged to release something else entirely. Inspector Slack was beginning to grasp the implications. You mean the poison gas you mentioned? Exactly. The killer had to solve several technical problems. How to store a lethal concentration of gas within the clock housing, how to ensure its release at the proper moment, and how to guarantee that Mrs. Pritchard would be in the correct position to receive a fatal dose. Miss Marple rose and moved to her own mantelpiece clock to illustrate her points. The storage problem was solved by creating a small chamber within the clock housing, easily accomplished by someone with sufficient mechanical knowledge. The timing was controlled by setting the clock to release its contents at a specific hour when Mrs. Pritchard would predictably be in her chair. Dr. Hawk nodded slowly. That would explain the sweet almond scent you detected. Hydrogen cyanide gas has exactly that characteristic odor, and it would dissipate relatively quickly in a room of that size. But how could the murderer be certain of Mrs. Pritchard's position? Inspector Slack asked. Surely she might have been anywhere in the house at the crucial moment. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of one whose careful observations had revealed their significance. That, Inspector, is where the rearranged furniture becomes crucial. When I visited Thornfield House after Mrs. Pritchard's death, I noticed immediately that her chair had been moved closer to the window, and the side table repositioned at an awkward angle. She paused to allow this information to sink in before continuing. Our killer had studied Mrs. Pritchard's habits very carefully. Every evening at 8, she would settle into her chair to read for precisely 1 hour before retiring. The murderer simply needed to ensure that the chair was positioned within the effective range of the gas when it was released. Inspector Slack was making rapid notes, and the furniture was moved during the killer's last visit to the house. Almost certainly, Miss Fenwick, or rather Margaret Sutton, had established herself as a welcome visitor who could move freely about the house. A few subtle adjustments to the furniture arrangement, ostensibly to improve the lighting for reading, or some similar domestic concern, would have aroused no suspicion whatever. Dr. Haddock had been considering the medical aspects of the crime. The beauty of this method is its reliability. Hydrogen cyanide is rapidly fatal in sufficient concentration, and the symptoms would closely mimic those of natural heart failure, particularly in an elderly person with existing cardiac issues. Miss Marple nodded gravely, precisely why this method was chosen. The killer needed Mrs. Pritchard's death to appear natural, at least initially. The poison would be absorbed by the victim's system, but in the absence of suspicious circumstances, a cursory medical examination might well conclude that heart failure was the cause of death. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes, but something went wrong with the mechanism during the funeral service. The clock chimed when it wasn't supposed to. Ah, yes, that was indeed an unintended consequence. Miss Marple agreed. The killer's modifications to the clock mechanism created an instability in its operation. The same alterations that allowed for the gas release also affected the clock's normal timekeeping function. The chiming during the funeral was actually the mechanism attempting to complete its modified cycle. She moved to the window and gazed out at her garden, where the last roses of the season were clinging to their stems, despite the advancing cold. I suspect our murderer was as surprised as anyone by that untimely chiming. It was, in fact, the first indication that the clock had been tampered with, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Dr. Haddock was still working through the technical details. The stop clock at 20 minutes 12. Was that significant? Very much so, Miss Marple replied. The mechanism seized at the moment of the gas release, unable to continue its normal operation after being modified so extensively. The killer had probably hoped that the clock would continue running normally, making the connection between the timepiece and the murder even less obvious. Inspector Slack gathered his notes and prepared to leave. This gives us a clear picture of how the crime was committed, but we still need to locate Margaret Sutton. She seems to have vanished completely. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. I rather think, Inspector, that our murderess has not gone as far as you might suppose. Someone who has planned so meticulously for so long would not simply flee without ensuring that her revenge was complete. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as Miss Marple reflected on the cold precision with which the crime had been executed. The combination of technical expertise and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits spoke of a mind that had spent years perfecting its plans for retribution. The mechanical nature of the murder seemed somehow fitting for a crime born of such calculated hatred, where human emotion had been channeled into the precise workings of springs and gears, transforming a symbol of domestic tranquility into an instrument of death. The gathering in Mrs. Pritchard's drawing room on Monday afternoon bore all the hallmarks of one of those peculiar social occasions that village life occasionally demanded. Inspector Slack had, at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, assembled the principal figures in the case for what he termed a final review of the evidence. The room itself seemed to watch with silent authority, as the participants took their places in the very space where murder had been committed. Robert and Millicent Pritchard sat stiffly on the sofa, their faces bearing the strain of the past week's revelations. Miss Hartwell occupied a chair near the window, her nervous hands folded tightly in her lap. Dr. Haddock stood by the mantelpiece, while Inspector Slack positioned himself with official dignity near the door. Miss Marple had chosen the chair that Mrs. Pritchard herself had favored, though she had quietly arranged for it to be moved back to its original position, well away from the fatal cuckoo clock that still hung motionless on the wall. "I have asked you all here," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, because I believe it is time for the complete truth to be revealed. We have learned a great deal about the method of Mrs. Pritchard's murder, but there remains one crucial element that has yet to be addressed." She paused, her mild blue eyes surveying the assembled company with the patient attention of one who had spent a lifetime observing human nature. "The person responsible for this crime is not, as we initially supposed it, a stranger to our village. Indeed, she has been among us for several months, carefully preparing her revenge under an assumed identity." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Miss Marple, we've established that the real Elenina Fenwick died years ago in Canada. The woman who used that name has disappeared completely." "Oh, but I don't think she has disappeared at all," Miss Marple replied with quiet certainty. "I believe she has simply resumed her true identity, confident that her plan has succeeded and that she is beyond suspicion." The drawing-room door opened at that moment. Mrs. Carmichael entered, escorting a slight dark-haired woman whom everyone except Miss Marple seemed surprised to see. "Miss Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, "or should I say Miss Margaret Sutton?" The woman who had been known to them all as Mrs. Pritchard's devoted companion stood frozen in the doorway, her face cycling through a series of emotions: shock, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate defiance. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved closer to the woman who had deceived them all so completely. "My dear, I'm afraid the game is quite over. You see, I realized yesterday that we had been looking for Elenina Fenwick in all the wrong places. The woman who had insinuated herself into this household, who had intimate knowledge of Mrs. Pritchard's habits and access to her daily routine, was not a recent arrival at all." The facade began to crumble as Miss Marple continued her gentle exposition. "You'd been planning this revenge for years, hadn't you? First you established yourself as Miss Hartwell, the perfect companion, devoted, unobtrusive, trusted. Then, when the time was right, you created the fiction of Elenina Fenwick to provide yourself with a motive that would point suspicion away from the household." Inspector Slack was staring at the woman with dawning comprehension. "You mean she's been here all along, playing both parts?" "Indeed," Miss Marple confirmed. "It was quite ingenious, really. As Miss Hartwell, she had complete access to the house and could observe Mrs. Pritchard's routines. As Elenina Fenwick, she could conduct research into the family history and arrange for the will to be changed. The two identities supported each other perfectly." Margaret Sutton's composure finally shattered. "She deserved to die," she said, her voice rising with years of suppressed fury. "Do you know what it's like to grow up believing your own mother threw you away like rubbish? To discover that she was living in comfort while you struggled to make your way in the world?" Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I can imagine the pain you must have felt, my dear. But surely you must see that this was not the answer, wasn't it?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "She spent her whole life making others feel worthless and unwanted. I simply gave her a taste of her own medicine. The inheritance scheme was perfect. She actually believed she was leaving everything to her precious niece, when all along she was ensuring that her despised stepchildren would get nothing." Dr. Haydock stepped forward. "But why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not simply confront her with the truth?" "Because," Margaret replied with cold precision, "I wanted her to die, knowing that she had been deceived just as I had been deceived all my life. I wanted her final act to be one of cruelty toward Robert and Millicent, so that she would go to her grave, having learned nothing about love or forgiveness." Inspector Slack moved to place the woman under arrest, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand to stay him for a moment. "Margaret," she said quietly, "you achieved your revenge, but at what cost? You have destroyed not only Mrs. Pritchard's life, but your own as well. And for what? The satisfaction lasted only as long as it took for the poison to work." Margaret Sutton's defiance finally collapsed entirely, and she began to weep with the helpless grief of a child who had spent 35 years nursing her wounds in solitude. As Inspector Slack led the broken woman away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of human potential that revenge so often represented. The drawing room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of various clocks throughout the house, all except the cuckoo clock, which would never chime again. That evening, As Miss Marple tended her garden in the fading light of autumn, she found herself listening to the cheerful sound of her own cuckoo clock, marking the peaceful hours. The mechanical bird's song, which had once seemed merely quaint, now carried deeper significance, a reminder that time itself was precious, and that the hours spent in hatred and planning revenge were hours that could never be reclaimed for love or happiness. She deadheaded the last roses of the season and reflected on the fundamental truth that had been demonstrated so tragically at Thornfield House, that the human heart, like a garden, would grow whatever was planted there, whether it be love or hatred, forgiveness or revenge. The choice has always belonged to the gardener.